Not surprisingly, our next expert speaker will be introduced by one of our NKDO team members.
And when I asked Chelsea Larson how she wanted to be described, she told me, "I'm currently a nursing student and a living kidney donor who hopes to make a difference in organ transplantation."
Hi everyone. When I was a freshman at the University of Minnesota, my favorite aunt told us she was donating her kidney to a stranger from her church. Are you nuts? I believe was my first thought after hearing the news. I had zero idea you could donate your organs while you were alive. 2 years later, my roommate went to study abroad and a random girl from Craigslist moved in to pay her rent. My 5 other roommates and I were hanging out at home one day when someone read our new roommate's Facebook post aloud. She was in kidney failure and was on dialysis. In that moment, I knew I would be a match and give her my kidney. I first learned about Abigail Marsh shortly after I learned about Donor to Donor in 2017. I quickly purchased her book and immediately it made me feel really good about myself. You see, she has studied psychopaths for many years, and if you're a Dateline fan like me, your ears just perked up. Her book, The Fear Factor, describes the differences between altruistic kidney donors and psychopaths and how we react, or don't, to others' fear. So, if you're sitting in here and you're a kidney donor, congrats, you are not a psychopath. Abigail is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Interdisciplinary Neuroscience program at Georgetown University. After her own life was saved by an altruist, Abigail went on to receive her Ph.D. in social psychology from Harvard University in 2004 and afterward conducted postdoctoral research at the National Institute of Mental Health until 2008. Current research projects include behavioral and brain imaging investigations of altruism among living altruistic kidney donors and stem cell donors, and behavioral and brain imaging investigations of the roots of conduct problems in children and adolescents. Her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the John Templeton Foundation, and has received awards and include the Wyatt Memorial Award for Translational Research from the National Institute of Mental Health and the Cozzarelli Prize for Scientific Excellence and Originality from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Please welcome Abigail Marsh.
Hi, I'm Abby Marsh. I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Georgetown University. My research is aimed at trying to understand what motivates people to help others, even when those others are strangers, even when helping involves making a major risk or sacrifice. And are people who take risks or make sacrifices to help others, like kidney donors, somehow different from those who don't? These are questions that I've been working towards answering for over 20 years, after a stranger risked his life to save mine when I was 19. In brief, what happened was I was driving down to my home in Tacoma, Washington, down this huge Interstate 5 freeway late at night one night, when, as bad luck would have it, a very small dog ran out in front of my car. And I did exactly the wrong thing, which is swerve to avoid it. And the combination of swerving and then hitting the dog anyways sent my car first fishtailing and then spinning in donuts across the freeway until finally it came to a stop in the fast lane of the freeway facing backward into oncoming traffic. And then my engine died. And I sat there for a little while, pretty sure that I was going to die too, until a stranger appeared at the passenger side of my car and said, "You look like you could use some help." I later figured out that he must have run across 5 lanes of freeway traffic in the dark to reach me. He ended up getting my car back up and running again, got me back to safety, made sure I was going to be all right, and then he just disappeared. I never even found out his name. This event left me wondering, as I'm sure it would have left anybody wondering, why did this man do what he did when so many of the other drivers that night, so many more than I could even count, just kept on going? Or in the words of Senator Cory Booker, who is himself a heroic rescuer, just driving in our car, most of us see problems and challenges. And the question is, are you going to be someone who just keeps on going or not? To answer these questions, we first need to understand, why do people help others? It's a simple question, and it's one that scientists have been trying to understand for a very long time, at least since the time of Darwin. Darwin puzzled that perhaps altruism shouldn't exist at all. Small-scale helping is pretty easy to explain, right? Why would somebody help somebody by picking up something they dropped? But when helping is risky or costly, and when the beneficiaries are strangers, scientists have puzzled for centuries how this behavior could emerge, biologically speaking. A surface understanding of natural selection would seem to suggest that altruists should all be weeded out in favor of more selfish people, ultimately leaving us with a purely selfish population. And yet, clearly, that's not what we have. Altruism exists. I'm living proof of that myself, luckily, as are, I know, many people watching this today. So the reason that altruism exists, in part, seems to be due to activity in a brain structure that I study called the amygdala. And the amygdala is a little clump of tissue. You've got one on either side of your brain, deep below the surface of the brain. It's about maybe 2 centimeters across. And it's a brain structure that we share with all mammals. And that's really key because there's something really special about mammals that's essential to understanding altruism. And that is that mammals have the good fortune of giving birth to very helpless, vulnerable offspring who need a lot of care. And the amygdala seems to be an essential structure for helping motivate mammals to provide care for those who are in distress or in need. We do know that the amygdala is responsible for a whole wide array of social and emotional functions, and we've known for a while that it must play an important role in compassion and altruism. This is in part because people who don't care about helping others, who lack compassion and altruism, usually have problems in the amygdala. So for example, there's a large body of research, including some conducted by my lab at Georgetown, that has linked structural and functional abnormalities in the amygdala to psychopathy. And just in brief, psychopathy, you may have heard people called psychopaths before. We try not to use that term anymore, just the same way we don't refer to people with any other mental disorder by their disorder. In any case, psychopathy is a developmental disorder, which means it has a strong genetic component and the early signs of it emerge pretty early in childhood. And it's characterized by a fearless temperament, an uncaring personality, and very limited amounts of what are called prosocial emotions, and that includes things like empathy and remorse and guilt. And research that my lab and others have conducted pretty reliably shows that people who are psychopathic have amygdalas that are quite a bit smaller than usual, and the smaller their amygdala, the less caring and compassionate they are. So in one study that my lab and I conducted recently of adolescents, the most callous and uncaring subjects in the study had amygdalas that were about 25% smaller than the most caring and compassionate subjects. And then other research we and others have done shows that the amygdala of people who are psychopathic tends to be less responsive to signs that other people are in distress. So for example, if somebody is looking very afraid, most people's amygdalas engage, become more active, and people who are psychopathic, that just doesn't happen. That's probably why people who are psychopathic are worse at recognizing when other people are experiencing distress. So if somebody looks afraid, and you or I would be able to recognize it as fear, people who are psychopathic often struggle to even figure out what the person is feeling. It's a really, really basic empathic deficit that they have. Now, the reason this is so interesting for us here today, because obviously we're not here to talk about psychopathy, is that what we know about psychopathy suggests the existence of something that I call a caring continuum, at the bottom of which are highly psychopathic people who have features like an unusually small amygdala, difficulty detecting when others are in distress. And then in the middle of this continuum are most of us, right? We're pretty compassionate, we're pretty good at recognizing others' distress. But then any good continuum, of course, has not just a bottom end, but a top end. And so the question is, what's at the top end of this continuum? Nobody had ever really looked at this until a few years ago. But if this caring continuum exists, it should be anchored at the high end by people who are, you could say, anti-psychopathic, people who are highly caring, and instead of being highly antisocial, are highly prosocial. And who might be characterized by features like increased amygdala volume, increased amygdala responsiveness to distress cues like fear, and, as a consequence of this supercharged amygdala, a lot more sensitivity to when other people are in distress, a lot better ability to just recognize when other people are, for example, afraid. So what would it mean if we found that highly altruistic people had these features? It would mean that we would be a huge step closer, not just towards understanding what makes altruists different, for example, altruistic kidney donors, but understanding mechanisms as to why people might ever be motivated to help others in the first place. So the tool that we needed to answer these questions was an MRI scanner like this one. And the MRI scanners that we use at Georgetown run special sequences that allow us to map both the structure and function of brain structures like the amygdala. So what we did in about 2010 was put out a nationwide call seeking altruistic kidney donors to come to Georgetown to have their brain scanned in an MRI machine like this one. There weren't nearly as many altruistic kidney donors as there are now. It makes me extremely happy how many there are now, but at the time there were fewer than 1,000. Of those, we brought about 19 of them into Georgetown to have their brain scanned, and we compared them to another 19 or so, just typical adults from the community, just any person who had never donated a kidney. This was the first MRI study of altruists of any kind, and so it was the first to be able to answer the question of what, if anything, makes people who go to great lengths to help other people different. So the first scan we ran assessed the structure of the amygdalas of altruists and controls. And I should emphasize that we made sure that these altruists and the controls that we matched them to were matched in terms of every characteristic we could think of. They were the same average age and the same gender composition, etc. The results of our first scan confirmed our prediction that altruists, the opposite of people who are psychopathic, have amygdalas that are larger than the average person by about 8%, as we found out. We also ran a functional series of scans during which both altruists and controls looked at a series of emotional facial expressions as they appeared on the screen. And these included angry expressions and neutral expressions, as well as fearful expressions. And we measured activity in the brains of altruists and controls as each expression appeared on the screen. Once again, the opposite of people who were psychopathic, we found increased activity in the right amygdala in altruistic kidney donors when they viewed other people's fear, and particularly their fear. It's not that people who are unusually altruistic are sensitive to every kind of social cue. They seem particularly sensitive to signs that somebody else is in distress, which makes a lot of sense because signs that people are in distress are usually what elicit care and compassion from people who see them. So it makes sense that people who are unusually caring and compassionate are particularly sensitive to these cues. Accordingly, we finally ran an emotion recognition task outside of the scanner, and we found that altruists were also better able to recognize fearful facial expressions. But again, only fearful facial expressions. They weren't any better than anybody else at recognizing anger, for example, which again makes them exactly the opposite of people who are psychopathic. And so if you look at these data all together, they pretty strongly support the idea of a caring continuum with people who were very altruistic on the high end and the opposite of people who were psychopathic. And we believe that one of the things that makes highly altruistic people different is that they have neural and cognitive features that make them unusually sensitive to other people's distress. And that sensitivity to others' distress makes them unusually motivated to help when others are in distress. That said, just based on this first study, there could totally be other alternatives. There are some people whose brains are very sensitive to signs of distress because they're really anxious and they overreact to lots of different kinds of emotional cues. Now, that's not what we thought was going on with altruistic kidney donors, but we weren't directly testing that question. So we hypothesized specifically that the brain differences that we were seeing in kidney donors specifically indicated that they have more empathy for other people's distress. And we wanted to put that directly to the test. So in our next study, we once again brought, I think this time it was 25 altruistic kidney donors to Georgetown, again compared them to typical adults, and what we wanted to do was assess whether altruistic kidney donors' brains exhibited signs of greater empathy than controls in response to distress. Now, from a neural perspective, empathy means the existence of what are called shared neural representations. And what, in other words, that means is that my brain is responding the same way when I feel an emotion, like fear or like pain, and when I see or hear or imagine somebody else experiencing that same emotion. It means I'm trying to simulate or somehow directly map the other person's emotional state onto my own. And so that's what we wanted to test. Do people who are unusually altruistic somehow simulate or map other people's fear and pain to a greater degree than the average person? And so to do this, again, we had altruistic controls go inside our brain scanner. And this time, instead of nicely and peacefully watching facial expressions on the screen, all of our study participants had to put their thumb inside a machine that we colloquially called a thumb smasher, although we tried not to call it that during testing. It was a little plastic pneumatic device that would pound down with a fairly intense pressure on people's thumbnails while we scanned their brains. And obviously would cause pain that we asked people to rate for us, and we would calibrate the device to an intensity that they described as slightly intense. So everybody was feeling slightly intense pain during the brain scan. In addition, they would hear cues that the thumb smashing was about to begin, and those anticipatory periods were the ones that we called the fearful expectation periods. So we were measuring the fear and also pain that people were experiencing while they were in the scanner. And I should note, as an aside, that one thing we didn't expect to find but did is that when we asked the altruists and controls to tell us what objective level of pressure pain felt like slightly intense pain to them, the altruistic kidney donors all picked quite a bit higher objective level of pain as feeling slightly intense, which suggests that altruistic kidney donors may have a higher pain tolerance than healthy controls. Again, not an anticipated result, but I think it's a really interesting thing that we could follow up on in the future. Then, altruists and controls watched from inside the scanner as a stranger they had just briefly met but not talked to had their thumb smashed inside the thumb smasher. And we measured what the altruists and the controls' brains did during that period. You can see that when controls were watching a stranger having their thumb smashed and had their own thumb smashed, there was some overlap between the activity when they were feeling the pain and when they were watching another person experience the pain. But the altruistic kidney donors showed a huge amount more overlap in these regions, including anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, which we know are regions that are particularly important for the experience of empathy. And if you look at this correlation graph, you can see that for any given altruist, the degree to which they were showing activity in regions like the insula when they were feeling pain strongly predicted activity in the same region when they were observing somebody else's pain. And we didn't find that same relationship at all for the controls. Even stronger evidence for empathic responding came from another analysis we did using a technique called MVPA, which means multivoxel pattern analysis. And the difference is that this analysis is looking at brain activity, not sort of average activity across a big region of the brain, but tiny details in the pattern of the activity happening within that region. We think it's coming closer to mapping what's actually happening within the brain region. And using this approach, we found that the exact pattern of activity within matched very closely when they were experiencing fear or pain and when they were observing somebody else experiencing fear or pain, which I think is maybe the strongest evidence we have yet for strong, empathic, self-other neural mapping in altruists. Potentially even more interestingly, I found this very interesting, we also found evidence that even when we asked all of the research participants, the altruists and the controls, to try their hardest to empathize with a stranger who was experiencing the fear and the pain, even after we asked everybody to do the same thing, altruists still showed evidence of greater empathic neural mapping of a stranger's pain, which suggests that it's not just that they're more likely to empathize with the pain or the fear of strangers, they're actually better at doing it. Now, obviously, any good scientific answer leads to even more questions. And to us, the next really obvious question was, why do altruists empathize even better with strangers' fear and pain than the average person? And there's a lot of different parts to that question. There's a lot of ways you could answer it. But one of the ones I wanted to understand is, what is different about the way that altruists think about strangers? And I've talked to a lot of altruistic kidney donors over the year. Probably since 2010, it's over 100 altruistic kidney donors, lucky me. And in talking to them about their experiences and about their motivations to donate, the conclusion I can't help but draw is that people who donate kidneys to strangers just care about strangers more. I mean, it might seem too obvious to say, but that really does seem to be the reality of it. They seem to value the welfare of any given stranger more than the average person does. Now, again, that seems sort of self-evident, but it's one thing to say it's self-evident, and it's another to actually test it empirically and demonstrate that it's true. The approach that we use to try to empirically demonstrate that altruistic kidney donors care about strangers more is a measure called a social discounting task. And this is a measure that asks people to make a series of choices to either keep some given amount of resources or split an amount of resources with another person. And if you split the resources with the other person, that means you've sacrificed some you could have kept for yourself. And the other person that you could choose to share with or not could be somebody really close to you, like a spouse or a best friend, or it could be somebody really distant from you, like a complete stranger. Now we know from lots of studies that have been done on this paradigm that most people who are making these choices, whether to keep stuff for themselves or share it with a stranger, shows a steep drop-off in generosity for more distant other people. And what this means is that they discount the value of outcomes for people who are more distant from themselves. They don't care about what happens to people who are not close to them as much. And so this is called a social discounting curve. The choices that people make in this task, and one of the reasons I chose to use the task, is because these choices map on really well, I think, to the decision to donate a kidney, right? So here's the set of resources in front of you, your own kidneys, and the question is, do you want to keep all these kidney resources for yourself, or do you want to share them equally with another stranger? And so I think given how nicely this task maps onto the decision to donate a kidney, we predicted that altruists would discount the value of resources shared with strangers less. So what we found, as we predicted, was that altruistic kidney donors show a much flatter discounting curve compared to typical adults when they're asked to share resources with strangers. Again, in short, they just care about their outcomes more. And what is really exciting is that we recently replicated this finding with a much bigger group of altruists. We had 130 some altruistic kidney donors, as well as pretty sizable samples of liver donors, directed kidney donors, heroic rescuers, humanitarian aid workers, and bone marrow donors. And what we found is all of these groups of altruists show more shallow discounting curves than the average person. We also found that if you look at all the different personality traits in the world that might go along with having a greater tendency to value the welfare of other people, there was only one that seemed to predict these shallower discounting curves that we found in all of these groups of altruists. You might be familiar with personality variables like conscientiousness and openness to experience and agreeableness. None of these seem to relate to the reduced discounting that we see in altruists. One personality trait does seem to make a difference, though, and this is a trait called honesty humility. Basically, what honesty humility index is how much more important than other people you think you are. And maybe not surprisingly, we found that altruistic kidney donors tend to rate very high on honesty humility, and so do all the other altruists we measured, which suggests that they just don't think they're more important than other people, right? So this is a big thing that makes donors different, is that they don't think they are different. They don't think they're better or inherently more important than anybody else. And I've heard this in lots of the interviews I've done as well. As one kidney donor put it when I asked why donating made so much sense to her, she said, "It's not about me." Another one said, "I'm not different. I'm not unique. Your study is going to find out that I'm exactly the same as you." Now, some of these differences are almost certainly due to biological differences, as we've seen, right? There are differences in the brain, although I should emphasize that they're not hardwired, right? Just because there's a difference in the brain does not mean we're looking at something that's necessarily genetic. There are definitely environmental factors that promote altruistic kidney donation as well. We know this because we see huge geographic variation in the proportion of altruistic kidney donors that come out of given regions. Like when we looked across the 50 US states, we see huge differences in how many altruistic kidney donors per capita the various states produce. Why is there this difference? One variable that seems to make the difference in predicting how many altruistic kidney donors emerge from a given place is thriving. The greater the degree to which people report that they're thriving in a state, and this is even after accounting for differences in wealth and health and education and gender and age. When people report that they're flourishing, that they're doing well, they feel connected to others and a sense of purpose in life, they're much more likely to act to help others. We've also found, even cooler, that this relationship holds not just for altruistic kidney donation in the United States, but it holds for living organ donation across countries. In countries where people report that they're thriving more, they're much more likely to donate organs to all sorts of different people. They're also more likely to donate to charity and to volunteer and to help strangers and to donate bone marrow and to donate blood and to treat animals well and to engage in all different kinds of altruism. The key really does seem to be thriving. So I think these results make clear that far from the Darwinian or the mythical Darwinian view of human nature, compassion and altruism are really part of our biological makeup. And it's true that some people seem to be more sensitive to the suffering and distress of others than the average person. And the things that seem to predict whether people will have that kind of care and compassion for others is first that they're empathic, maybe not a huge surprise. People who are donors, people who are unusually altruistic, really seem to understand, seem to map the fear and the distress of others better than the average person. This is probably because they actually care about strangers more. They seem to resonate with their distress because they care about their distress more than the average person. And one of the reasons this seems to be is because they're flourishing, they're thriving. Thriving seems to make a big difference in whether people who have the potential capacity to be altruistic towards others actually carry out those behaviors. And I think I'll wrap up there with the optimistic message that this suggests that one of the ways that we can make the biggest difference in promoting altruistic kidney donation is to promote thriving in the world, because when people seem to be doing well, they seem to be doing good. And I think that that's one of the reasons I'm so happy to be a part of Donor to Donor, which has this wonderful mission of helping people to do well and to do good as time goes on. Thank you.